This is The Cluttered Path, where we pursue entertainment, humor, self-improvement, and meaning in life. My name is Todd, and I'm here with James.
Good day. How you feeling, Todd?
I'm doing well, brother. Thanks.
You know, we've received some listener questions. Seems like it'd be a good time to respond to some of those.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. First question. How did you come up with the name of your podcast?
Very good question. The Cluttered Path. As we were kicking around ideas about the podcast, we were like, what are we going to make this about, you know? And, our niche is basically about life and self-improvement and entertainment and stuff like that. But life isn't a straight path. It's complex and often a very arduous journey. So we face a lot of difficulties in life. And our podcast, what we're going to do is tell stories and have interviews about life. So The Cluttered Path is a title that resonated with us.
Awesome. Number 2, related question. What is the purpose of the podcast?
Wow, another good one. Our primary goal here is to entertain our listeners. And we want to do that with interesting stories and conversation. So we're building a place for people who like to consider the deep complexities of life and of the human existence, and doing that as a path toward self-improvement and meaning in life. So the podcast, our goal is to make this a means to that end. So we're planning on telling stories about interesting people and events. And let's just hope people find it interesting.
Indeed. let's hope that. Question 3 then. How did you decide on Genghis Khan as the very first topic of discussion?
Wow. Yeah. A friend of mine was like, dude, you really hopped in the deep end on this one with your first outing. And really good question. So Genghis Khan, in a roundabout way, was a shaping influence on my life as a young Marine. And he came in through a man named Dan Hall. So Dan Hall was my company gunny up in Washington, D.C. when I was stationed there. And then after transferring down to Camp Lejeune, he was my company first sergeant for a time. So as a young Marine, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines down at Camp Lejeune, Dan gathered us together for a company chat. And he was a great storyteller. He regaled us with the story of these, he called them the Mangudai warriors. So I'll say these are mythical warriors. But they were supposedly the special forces of Genghis's army. And bottom line is, we don't know if that was actually true or not, but Dan Hall is really, he's really good at influencing young 18 to 22-year-old men. So he came up with this story. But the bottom line is, at his leading, our company adopted this identity of the Mangudai warriors. We kind of looked at each other and said, yes, we're the Mangudai. And from then on, Weapons Company, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, we were to be known as Mangudai, or at least until our deployment was over. But that ended with the next batch of people that came in. But whatever the case, the Mangudai was inculcated into everything we did as part of our company. I mean, our radio call signs were stuff like Mangudai 6 Actual. That's what our company commander called himself. And we sang running cadences talking about the Mangudai. It became our identity.
It was motivating.
Yeah, it really bonded us together. I mean, every unit in the military is different, and, everyone's dressed the same and everyone's looking the same, but literally the personalities are what makes each unit unique. And Dan Hall really introduced that to us, and it was a good time. It was a really fun, exciting, adventurous time in life. So here I am years later considering this podcast, and men like Dan Hall were such a huge influence on me. So I decided to actually research Genghis Khan. And you know what happened? The true story of Genghis Khan is way more interesting than what I could have imagined.
Agreed. When you first mentioned the book, I thought, interesting. But after picking up the book and listening and reading, how cool. Thanks so much for the selection. I'm glad you had that experience.
Awesome. I'm thankful for it, man.
Thanks for your questions. If you have questions or comments, you can email us directly at feedback@clutteredpath.com.
Thanks, James. So last episode, we talked about the tragic childhood of Temujin, a.k.a. Genghis Khan. That is his birth name, Temujin. In the last episode, we went through the story where Holun, Temujin's mother, was kidnapped from her first husband by the man who would become Temujin's dad. And then Temujin's dad is murdered by a rival clan, poisoned at some kind of party. And then we talked about Temujin's stepbrother, Begter, who was a bully, and he was slated to become head of clan, so Temujin kills him. Very dramatic story. But then we also had a love story. There was this marriage to Borte, but she would be eventually abducted by another clan. So today's episode, we're going to talk about this story of a reluctant warrior who was drawn into this life of horrific violence. He was simply trying to enjoy life with his wife and small clan, and we pick up the story at the abduction of Temujin's wife, Borte. So we'll start with an excerpt from the book. It's called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, written by Jack Weatherford. But before I start the excerpt, think about the goal of our podcast, and as we discuss these topics, try to zero in on the human factor. That's what we're looking at. We want to look at the meaning behind the story. So that's the goal of these readings and studying these heroes, or not necessarily heroes, but large people in human history. But let's start with an excerpt from the book. When Temujin caught up with the Taichiud, they proved more difficult to defeat than expected. The steppe mode of warfare consisted primarily of shooting arrows at one another from horseback or from fixed positions behind the protection of rocks, or in the case of the wooded Onan area, hastily assembled log barricades. When fighting, the steppe warriors sought to avoid being splattered by blood, so they rarely fought close to one another in hand-to-hand combat. The breath or odor of the enemy carried a part of his soul, and thus warriors sought to avoid the contamination of even smelling their enemy. The attackers swarmed down toward their enemies on horseback, firing arrows rapidly as they approached, then turned and continued firing as they fled. Sometimes the defenders rode out with long poles with which they tried to dismount their opponents and then shoot them as they stumbled back to their feet. Temujin's army and the Taichiud fought all day without either side gaining a clear advantage, though Temujin's forces apparently instilled the greater fear of defeat in their foes. According to the account in the Secret History, late in the day an arrow pierced Temujin Khan's neck. As darkness fell, the two opposing armies laid down their arms and made camp close to each other, on the same field where they had spent the day fighting. Though this may seem strange, by staying close together during the night, they could more effectively watch each other and prevent a surprise attack. Though Temujin's wound was not deep, he lost consciousness after sunset. Such wounds carried a high risk of infection, or possibly poison had been applied to the arrow. His loyal follower, Jelme, the next in command, stayed by his side through the evening and sucked the blood from the wound. In order to prevent offending the earth by spitting the blood on the ground, Jelme swallowed it. In addition to the religious reasons for his acts, hiding the blood had the practical value of preventing the other warriors from seeing how great the blood loss was. Only when Jelme was too full to swallow any more, and the blood began trickling down from his mouth, did he begin to spit it onto the ground. Wow. So this is an excerpt from the battle between Temujin and the clan of his boyhood blood brother, Jamuka. It demonstrates the strong bonds between Temujin and the men he led.
And it is so interesting to see their values and beliefs in practice. The blood, the odors, etc.
Yes, and we're going to dig into that in this episode. So we'll be looking at their religious beliefs and how it drove their behavior. Very interesting aspects of the lives of the Mongolians. So we'll pick up the story at the place where Temujin's mother, Holun, is captured.
And remind us again how old Temujin is presently in the story.
Good question. He's only about 17 years old at this point, so a young chap, but a lot of responsibilities are falling on him. So we start at this section of the book where the Merkid raid Temujin's camp. It happened in a pre-dawn raid. There was an old woman that was part of the clan, and she actually heard them approaching and alerted the clan. She felt the vibration of the horse's hooves and sounded the alarm. And then at that point, after the alarm was sounded, Temujin flees. He gathers together with 7 boys, Temujin's mother, Holan, and his sister, and they all fled in a hurry. Borte, the stepmother, and the old woman that had woke them all up, they were left behind. So here's another excerpt from the book. In the desperate tribal world where daily life skirted so close to potential tragedy and annihilation, no one had the luxury of artificially chivalrous attitudes or codes of behavior. In the quick decision of their utilitarian calculus, leaving these 3 women as booty would at least slow the raiders enough so that the others might have time to escape. So they had to flee to the mountains for refuge, and the tent that they were living in, was just left standing. And then we find that Borte is captured. The old woman was leading an ox cart away with Borte inside. She was trying to just get her out of the area. But the Merkid raiding party, they descended on them. They found Borte and seized her. And for Temujin and the group that was with him, they were just constantly on the move for days after that, because the Merkid were prowling the area. And the group with Temujin, they hid along the slopes of the mountain and the wooded areas of a place called Mount Burkhan Khaldun. And the Merkid, they finally abandoned their search and they went back to the northwest of the area, back to their tribal home. So Temujin fears it's just a trap to lure him out, though. So he ends up having several boys track the Merkid to make sure it wasn't a trap. But wow, dramatic time. This raid, it really put Temujin's clan into a desperate situation where, they had to choose the lesser of 2 evils. Stand together and fight the raiding party, or divide the camp to at least slow the advance of the Merkid.
Yeah, the context here is literal life and death. Hard for me to wrap my head around. To protect themselves, they ran away as fast as possible. But I like the way the book puts it. There was no room for artificially chivalrous code.
Just brutality, man. Grab your stuff and let's go. No time to think.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine leaving some of my family behind.
Right. It's crazy, man. He left his wife and took his mom. And I can only surmise what happened. Hey, mom, grab your stuff and let's go. Just a chaotic environment. And I would love to have a Q&A with Genghis Khan and just ask him what happened that day. Obviously, we can't do that, so we can only guess. Regardless, Temujin and his smaller band, they're in a terrible situation. At this point, the geography of Mongolia and Temujin's religious beliefs come into focus. They're near this place called Mount Burkhan Khaldun, and the book takes us to what I call a mountaintop experience for Temujin. We'll start with another excerpt from the book. Hiding in the forest of Mount Burkhan Khaldun, Temujin faced the pivotal decision of his life, deciding what to do about the kidnapping of his wife. He could have chosen to abandon any hope of recapturing Borte, and that would certainly or surely have been the expected course, as his small group could not possibly take on the much more powerful Merkid. In due time, Temujin could find another wife, but he would have to kidnap her, as his father had done to his mother, because no family would voluntarily bestow their daughter on a man who had already lost one wife to more powerful men. In the past, Temujin had relied upon his quick wits to fight or flee, but the decisions had been spontaneous ones in response to a sudden danger or opportunity. Now he had to think carefully and devise a plan of action that would influence the whole of his life. He had to choose his own destiny. In the belief that he had just been saved by the mountain where he was hiding, he turned in prayer to the spirit of the mountain. End of excerpt. And that's where we get into Temujin's religious beliefs. First off, they were animists, so they actually prayed to the spirits around them. And they worshipped they called it the eternal blue sky and the golden light of the sun and spiritual forces of nature. And they had a view of the human soul that it was contained in the moving essences of blood, breath, and aroma. And the natural world, they viewed that as being divided into 2 parts, earth and sky. The soul of the earth was contained in the moving water of the rivers. The rivers flowed through the earth like blood through our bodies. That's how they viewed the earth. And so then we get to this interesting thing where there were three rivers that emerged from Mountain Burkhan Khaldun. And that mountain, if you translate that, it literally means God Mountain, because Burkhan Khaldun became the most sacred mountain in Mongolia, even till today. So there's a connection here. This is the earthly place that is closest to the eternal blue sky for the Mongolians. So that's the connection here, and that's why it became so sacred. And this unique geography where three rivers begin here, and as the source of three rivers, this becomes the sacred heart of the Mongol world. And the book calls this, quote, the cradle of Mongolia's nationhood. Here's another excerpt from the book. For the steppe tribes, political, worldly power was inseparable from supernatural power, since both sprang from the same source, the eternal blue sky. In order to find success and to triumph over others, one must first be granted supernatural power from the spirit world. For his spirit banner to lead to victory and power, it had to first be infused with supernatural power. So these were their core beliefs. And these core beliefs led Temujin to what the book describes as 3 days of prayer and worship. So he starts off by praying. He expresses gratitude for escaping death. He prays to the mountain and thanks it for protecting him. He prays to the sun that rode across the sky, expresses thanks to the sun. And then he offers up special thanks to the old woman that heard the Merkid approach and warned them. So he starts off in prayer with gratitude, and then he performs acts of worship. The first thing he does is he sprinkles milk into the air and onto the ground to thank spirits around him. I don't know the significance of milk. Maybe it could be, the life-giving essence of milk. I'm not sure. But he did that as an act of worship. And then he unwinds his sash or his belt, and he hangs it around his neck. And the significance of the sash or the belt is it is the center of a Mongolian man's identity. So removing this meant he was removing his own strength, and it's a symbol of his powerlessness before the gods around him. So he sprinkles the milk in the air and on the ground. He unwinds his sash and belt, and then he removed his hat and dropped to the ground 9 times. And he did this as a means of kowtowing before the sun and the mountain. Here's another excerpt. Temujin's 3 days of prayer while hiding on Burkhan Khaldun marked the beginning of a long and intimate spiritual relationship that he would maintain with this mountain and the special protection he believed it provided. James, this mountain would be the source of his strength.
So this 17-year-old young man has gone through all this stuff and has just lost his wife again. And so he takes 3 days to pray and worship. I found that unexpected, as their culture is one of hunting and survival.
Right. I mean, historically, we think of the Mongolians as just bloodthirsty warriors, but there's a lot more to them. There is a belief system that's driving them. So, I mean, while you and I aren't animists, it's still interesting to see the parallels of his actions and those of other religions. I mean, for example, humbling yourself before your object of worship, laying things aside and kowtowing and praying and things like that. I mean, those are kind of universal things that we do. I mean, even if you're not religious, you're worshiping something. Right. And we dedicate time and we have our rituals, even if it's just sports, we go through rituals sometimes with our favorite teams and things like that. It's just who we are as humans. So, I mean, the earth and sky were of huge religious significance for Temujin and his clan and the larger group of people that would become the Mongolians. And so Temujin believed that the mountain itself provided guidance on the way forward. So the book goes into now, he calls it the tale of 3 rivers. So these 3 rivers that emanate from the mountain, they represent Temujin's options. Option 1 is the Kurland River that flows to the southeast of the mountain. So it's actually going in the direction of the wide open areas of the steppe. And so the decision or the option available to him from represented by the Kurland River, is he can give up on Borte and face future raids and more loss. But that's a bad choice. If he goes southeast, he ends up in this wide open area and faces the possibility of just being attacked, right? Because that is the nature of living on the steppe. These roaming bands of Mongolians or their predecessors attacking one another. That's a bad choice. Option 2 was represented by the Onon River that flows to the northeast. And then in the northeast of the mountain, it's a more wooded and isolated area, and it offers a lot more protection from raids. If he followed this decision, though, he would have to give up on Borte, as with option 1. He could have a safer life, but with less opportunity for prosperity. It's a bad choice for him. And then option 3, the Toul River, it flows to the southwest. And if he followed that path, he would have to go rescue Borte. That was option 3. And if he did this, if he went to the southwest, he could seek the help of Ong Khan. We've met him in the last episode. His name is actually Torgil, but he would eventually be renamed Ong Khan. And he would have to seek the help of Ong Khan to rescue Borte from the Merkid. So background here, a year earlier when Ong Khan adopted Temujin as his son, there was an offer from Ong Khan to become a leader in his clan. He presented that to Temujin, but Temujin declined as he wanted to avoid all these internecine battles with the other clans. Regardless, so that's the background. He'd have to seek the help of this man who was his adoptive father in the absence of his own father. Temujin chose option 3. There's no other way to get his wife back. So options 1, 2, and 3, he chose to get his wife back. Here's another excerpt from the book. Though he had sought to create a quiet life apart from the constant turmoil of steppe warfare, the Merkid raid had taught him that such a life was simply not to be had. If he did not want to live the life of an impoverished outcast, always at the mercy of whatever raiders chose to swoop down on his encampment, he would now have to fight for his place in the hierarchy of steppe warriors. He would have to join in the harsh game of constant warfare he had thus far avoided. Aside from all the issues of politics, hierarchy, and spiritual power, Temujin showed how desperately he missed Borte, the one person in a short and tragedy-laden life who brought him happiness. Despite the emotional reserve that Mongol men were expected to show in public, particularly in the presence of other men, Temujin made a strong emotional affirmation of his love for Borte and of his pain without her. He lamented that not only had the attackers left his bed empty, but they had cut open his chest and broken his heart. Temujin chose to fight. He would find his wife, or he would die trying. After those 3 difficult days of pondering, praying, and planning on the mountain, Temujin followed the Toul River down to search for the camp of Ong Khan and seek his help. But he would do so not as a lonely outcast. He would do so as the rightful son who had already brought the powerful Ong Khan a prized sable coat and allegiance. So just as a takeaway, in our last episode, right after the marriage to Borte, the custom was for a gift to be given to the parents, and Temujin had no dad. And so his wife provided this sable coat, provided it to Ong Khan, and Ong Khan adopted him. But, the takeaway, this situation, it really makes me think of a story I read about a slave in early America. This slave had married a wife, and they were sold off separately and split apart. Just a terrible situation. But as I was reading the story, it begs the question, why would a slave choose to get married knowing the likelihood that he might be split up or lose his wife? And in an interview, the slave actually talked about the debilitating loneliness of his cruel existence. And he had this natural human desire for connection and comfort that comes from loving another person. So even with the horrible conditions of slavery, he chose to risk the pain of loss to experience love. And if you apply that to Temujin, his life was cruel and unforgiving, but he loved Borte. He would do whatever he could to be with his wife. And I'm struck by the fact that I don't perceive that he had to gin up the courage to do it. Attempting a rescue was literally the only option for him.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a stark contrast to what just happened. In the moment, he ran away and left her out of self-preservation. But now, after taking time out to pray and contemplate his choices, he decides to risk his life and that of his family to go mount a rescue. Just an incredible choice given the circumstances.
I agree. A split decision, to leave her, but then after the fact, he had time to sit and think about his life without Borte. Lots of grief. And I can only imagine the grief of your wife being kidnapped and taken away and the idea of life without her. But he decided to rescue her and die if necessary to get her back. And just as an aside, here in our modern world, if someone's kidnapped, you can go to the FBI, you can call the police, and they can have hostage, negotiators and rescue and all of that stuff. None of this was in existence for Temujin on the plains or on the steppes. He had to make it happen himself, and he would die if necessary to get her back.
Yeah, and he sees it as his only choice.
Yes. So it's another interesting aspect of Temujin, who would become Genghis Khan. True love story here. Much more. There's just much more to Genghis Khan than a warrior. So he made the decision. So Temujin then asks On Khan for help, and that's where we get to the next segment of the book. So On Khan will render support for this effort. And the reason for that is he actually had an old score to settle with this Merkid clan. So he agreed to the fight readily, but then he instructed Temujin to actually go recruit his old boyhood friend Jamuka for the fight. And they joined the fight. So there isn't too much downtime here. They mount up and they all march out to fight the Merkid to rescue Borte. And then the book provides their order of march. So Temujin clan, their clan was right in the middle of the march of the formation. On Khan was on the right or the western side of Temujin's clan, and then Jamuka was on the left or the east side. So that was their order of march. And they entered the battle, and Temujin really proved himself up to the test at this point. So they conducted a nighttime raid on the Merkid encampments. Immediately, the Merkid flee in a panic as their gurs are just looted. So this combined army of On Khan, Jamuka, and Temujin's clan, they're just looting the gurs. The Merkid are fleeing. And what Temujin does in the middle of all of this is he frantically searches for Borte, going camp to camp, just screaming her name. And then the book gives us, from Borte's perspective, right after she had been captured, she was given to an older man to be his wife. And she was being carted away during the raid. So that she had no idea who was conducting the raid. The only thing she knew was that she didn't even imagine it was a rescue. She just knew that she didn't want to be kidnapped again. So she was scared. And here's an excerpt of their reunion. Suddenly, amid the confusion and turmoil around her, Borte heard a voice crying out her name and recognized it as Temujin's. Jumping from the cart, she raced through the darkness toward the voice. Temujin twisted frantically in his saddle as he peered out at the night and shouted her name again and again. He became so distraught that he did not know her as she ran toward him, and when she grabbed the reins of his horse and snatched them from his hand, he almost attacked her before he recognized her, whereupon they threw themselves upon each other in an emotional embrace. So this was an action-packed emotional reunion of a young husband and wife, and it really does seem like a movie script.
Yeah, this would make a really great movie.
Yes, I would say it could also make a Hallmark movie, just have to leave out all the killing.
Yeah, there's that. So it's funny. So there is a Russian movie about his early life. I have not seen it. And there is a TV show, Marco Polo. It's a drama set after the reign of Genghis Khan. I've only seen excerpts, so I can't really recommend it either. But Marco Polo apparently interacts with Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan.
That could be very interesting. I'll have to look that up. And if you're listening to this and you know these movies and can recommend, send us some feedback at feedback@clotedpath.com. Sorry, I had to put that plug out there, but we do welcome your feedback. So there was this decisive victory over the Merkid. Temujin and Borte are reunited, and then a new clan is formed. So Temujin actually joins Jamuka's clan. So these two clans become one. But immediately there's controversy in Temujin's his household. Not long after Borte's rescued, they find out she's pregnant. So there are questions about the paternity of the child. And then in 1179, Borte gives birth to a son named Joki, and it means visitor or guest. But the history of the Mongols is very silent on the paternity situation, but there would be conflict in Mongol politics for the next century. So it starts off with this controversy at home in this section of the book. But then it gets into Jamuka and Temujin swearing loyalty to one another for a third time. So this time they did it twice as boys, but this time they did it as grown men, and their followers were witnesses to the event. And as with all of their activities, there is usually a ritual associated. And so they have a ritual here where they're swearing loyalty to one another. And there's just great symbolism and meaning where two lives become one. They stood beside the edge of a cliff. They were by a tree at the edge of a cliff. There was significance to that for them. They exchanged golden sashes and strong horses. So if you remember, the sash was his identity. So they're exchanging their identities with one another, and strong horses were very prevalent in their thinking and their culture. And then they slept apart from the larger group under the same blanket. So here's an excerpt talking about this. By exchanging clothing, each shared his body smell and therefore the essence of his soul with the other. The sash, in particular, embodied the symbol of their manhood. They swore a public oath to let us love one another and make two lives into one, never to forsake each other. Celebrating their pledges with a feast, including much drinking, Temujin and Jamuka publicly symbolized their brotherhood by sleeping apart from the others under a single blanket, just as true brothers grow up sharing a single blanket. So they essentially got married as guys, but that's just an aside. So they're carving out. So they've combined. They've sworn their loyalty to one another again, and they've combined their two clans into one another. But then Temujin has to carve out a new role for himself here because he's joining Jamuka's clan. Not much change for Jamuka, except for adding all of the new people. So here are the big changes for Temujin. First off, he's moving physically from the protection of the mountains down into an open area called the steppe. And that move itself means that Temujin has to go from being a hunter to a livestock herder. Now, he loved hunting, but we learned that livestock actually provided a higher standard of living for them. And the open area of the steppe, it led to constant fighting between clans. So another big change that Temujin had to make was he had to assume the role of a warrior, but he would excel at it, as we'll see going on. But those were big changes for Temujin. But we also learned that Jamuka was actually the head of the clan. So if you remember from last episode, Temujin and Jamuka, they were Andas, or ceremonial brothers. And this Anda ceremonial brother role gave Temujin special status in the clan. He didn't join Jamuka's clan as a regular member. He joined as a sort of co-leader, but still subordinate to Jamuka. So Temujin ended up following Jamuka's lead, and he learned from him for about a year and a half, but conflicts will emerge. So there's this sort of palace intrigue surrounding the paternity of Borte's child. Then there's major upheaval for Temujin when the clans merge. The mighty hunter becomes a herder of livestock, and he also takes on the role of warrior to battle other clans.
Yeah. So now 19, he's taking on a new role. This is like step one of Temujin taking on the role of warrior in his path to Khan. And as we'll see, this will introduce new challenges.
Yeah, new challenges ahead. And not long after they settle into these new lives, rivalries emerge. So we'll stop at this point. that concludes today's episode. Leave you with a bit of a cliffhanger on what happens next. Let's do a quick summary of what we talked about today. We talked about the abduction of Borte, Temujin's wife, and then we went into Temujin's mountaintop experience, where he entered into 3 days of prayer and worship. And then a new clan forms between Jamuka and Temujin, but rivalries are going to emerge. So just to reiterate our call to action here on this, as we're going through these stories about Genghis Khan, just think about the human element here. Put yourself in the place of these people and contrast your current state with where they're living back in these times. So I find that very interesting. Next episode, we're going to dig into the conflict between the two clans, and we're going to see that Temujin becomes his own Khan, and then he will implement a radical new power structure. Thanks for listening to The Cluttered Path. Today's episode was made possible by the writings of Jack Weatherford from his book Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Copyright 2004 by Broadway Books, a division of Penguin Random House. Music for today's episode is used with permission of the Lack family.